Hi, I'm Bobby, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing some of my favourite books and series. So the first series I want to talk about is one that is not yet finished. So that is the Trials of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend. The first book in the series is Nevermore, the second book is Wondersmith, and there is a third book coming out later this year, I believe in October, called Hollowpox. This is a middle grade fantasy book about a girl called Morrigan, and the day that she was born was a really unlucky day, and so she is believed to be cursed. So because of this curse, Morrigan gets blamed for any bad thing that happens in their town, like if someone gets injured or if there's bad weather or something, she gets blamed for all of it. Also, because of this curse, she is told that she's going to die on her 11th birthday. However, when it gets to her 11th birthday, she is whisked away by a man called Jupiter North, and she's taken to the land of Nevermore. So when she reaches the land of Nevermore, Morrigan has to compete in these trials in order to get into the Wondrous Society, which is basically the school for the elite people. She has to perform magic powers and things, and she doesn't know any magic, so she's very confused about why she's been put into this competition. I enjoyed this story because the fantasy setting is really interesting. The land of Nevermore has so much magic. Morrigan is staying in a hotel that, like, the rooms change on different days, and there's different characters. Like, there's a giant talking cat who was so funny. I just found this story full of lots of fun and adventure, and I can't wait for the sequel to come out in October. So the first book she's doing the competition, and in the second book it's set in a magic school, and I always love a magic school setting. I don't know what the third book's going to be about, but I feel like from Hollowpox there was something about some I was going to say deadly disease, but like, oh god, everything's a pandemic now, isn't it? So I'm thinking that I need to reread these two books before October so that I completely know what's going on when I get to the third book. So the second series on this list is the Arc of the Scythe series, which is Scythe, Thunderhead, and The Toll by Neil Shusterman. I'm just going to hold the first book because they're kind of heavy. So this book has been quite popular recently. It's a young adult sci-fi kind of fantasy, like sci-fi fantasy mix. It is set in a false utopia where no one can die. People don't die of old age or disease, or like if they're murdered or if they attempt suicide. There are trigger warnings for suicide attempts in this story. Then they don't die. They can get revived and everything, so they believe it's like the perfect world. But the way that they control overpopulation is with people called Scythes, who are given the power to kill people, and they call it gleaning. So it is set about 200 years after death has been eradicated. In the first book we follow two teenagers, Citra and Rowan, who are basically apprentices to become Scythes. Citra and Rowan are studying like different ways of killing people and ethics and things. It's a very political story. Like, different sides have different ethics about who to murder and how to murder them. There's a lot of graphic violence in this story, which you can sort of imagine from the topic. And then every few months they have to go to a conclave of Scythes and compete against all the other apprentice Scythes. So, as I said, the first book follows their apprenticeship, and the sequels follow the repercussions of what happened. I really enjoyed the first book. It is a great story, and if you only want to read one story in the series, just read this one. It will do as a standalone, but the ending is quite dramatic, and it does really make you want to read the second book. The Head, which, by the way, is the name of their artificial intelligence that basically controls everything. More dramatic story than the first one, and the ending is so good, and it leaves you on such a cliffhanger, and honestly I was so annoyed I had to wait like a year for the sequel. So yeah, Thunderhead was a really good story and had a great ending. The Toll came out last year and I'm still not sure how I feel about it. There's lots of different things that happen in this book and I don't know, it's not as good as the other two. And like the final ending of this, I'm still not sure how I feel about it. It's not the best book in the series, I think, but maybe if I read it again I'd probably enjoy it more. I'd definitely recommend reading the series for at least the first book. Honestly, that makes it sound like it's a bad series, but like I'm just not sure how I feel about this last book. So the next series I want to talk about is the Tearling trilogy, which starts with The Queen of the Tearling and is then followed by Invasion of the Tearling, finally The Fate of the Tearling, and these are by Erica Johansson. It's been a few years since I read this series. I don't remember a lot of detail about it. Honestly, I had to look it up to be able to do this video. So it's about this girl called Kelsey who grew up away from the kingdom, or it's kind of a queendom. She grew up away from the queendom where she was born. Her mother is the queen, and Kelsey was taken away so that she could be protected, so that when she was old enough to become heir, then she'd be safe, and they wanted her like educated to be the best kind of queen they could have. Her mother dies before Kelsey's old enough, and Kelsey's uncle is the Prince Regent, and he's like a really cruel ruler. He doesn't do a lot of good for the people in his kingdom, and like there's lots of people who are poor and suffering. And there is another sort of land nearby that is ruled by the Red Queen, and she is like magical and super evil, and honestly I quite liked her. So I don't really remember the finer details of this series. The first book is about Kelsey learning how to be a queen and how to be a good ruler of her land. I remember there were some characters who I really liked. So there's a character called Lazarus who is sort of in charge of all the guards and basically is like Kelsey's personal protector, or whatever you want to call it. And he was really cool. He was like older, scarred, war-beaten, like he's been through all the stuff and now he's just there to protect the queen. I really liked Lazarus as a character. He took no nonsense from anyone, he had a great attitude, he said some really fun things, and I just really enjoyed reading when he was in the story. The other character who I really liked is called the Fetch. So he was like an infamous thief who no one could capture. Like he could be right up in the face of the queen and no one can capture him. He was a fun character. He kind of reminds me of Kelsia from the Mistborn trilogy, which I'm currently reading. But I'm thinking I want to reread this series because I don't remember a lot of detail about it, and I remember being kind of disappointed with the ending of the trilogy. I wasn't really satisfied with the epilogue, but I think like before the epilogue it was really good. Why do they ruin stories with epilogues? But yeah, I want to reread this series soon. They're quite chunky books. Like the first one is like just under 500 pages, and I think it's the shortest book in the series. So it does take some time to get through, but I think rereading it would be really good. I remember really enjoying reading this series. There was lots of fun. There was so much magic, so many different characters. It was really, really entertaining. So I highly recommend it for anyone who's into fantasy or like just starting to get into fantasy. Like teenagers who are just starting to get into fantasy, I think this is a good place to start. It's not too intimidating, like it is quite big, but the story isn't too complex, you know. So the fourth book I want to talk about is really famous and it's standalone, and that is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. It's about a German girl called Liesel. At the beginning of the story, she loses her brother as her mother is taking them to live with different people. Like she's taken to live somewhere safer during the war. So Liesel grows up with these adopted parents, and this story is basically just about her life and sort of watching her grow up during a war. So at the beginning of this story, she steals her first book, and when she gets to her new parents' home, she is talking to them about it and sort of realises that they realise that she can't read. So the dad takes it upon himself to teach Liesl to read. While it's tragic and it's difficult to read because of the time period, it's a really lovely story about love and friendship and family. Liesl befriends a boy called Rudy, who is he's known in their town for being a bit crazy. It talks about this time when he was younger, and there was this famous bike runner who he was like fascinated by, and he decided to cover himself in chalk and run around a racetrack in the middle of the night. And like that's basically his reputation in the whole town. And like he's just a bit, I don't know, quirky. Like he stands out in their town. And Liesl befriends Rudy, and they grow up together, and you can sort of see them, like, there's sort of love there, but they don't know about it. They just think they're just friends and whatever. Liesl learns a lot during these few years. It's a really interesting story, just watching one person grow up and just how much she changes in the course of a few years. The standout thing about this book that everyone talks about is that the narrator for this story is Death. So Death is talking about how the war is ruining the world and how it's killing so many people, keeping him busy and all that stuff. And it's just a really interesting perspective, like especially because there's a war, there's so many people dying. Like there's a world war, there's people dying all over the world, like way more than normal, and it's just an interesting perspective to see like people's final moments, and that's sort of what he knows about. He knows people's final moments. I really enjoyed reading this story. I reread it recently and I loved it just as much the second time as I did the first time. There are some really emotional moments in there. Of course, because it's set during World War II, there are triggers for war, violence, death, all these kind of things. And of course it's very, very tragic. Like lots of people are dying throughout this book, so don't get too attached to anyone. That's my advice. But yeah, this is going to be a difficult read for a lot of people, so don't go into this book too lightly, honestly. But it is an enjoyable read. It's very emotional and very character driven. It's a beautiful story. The next series of books I want to talk about is a series that I think is quite underrated. I haven't really heard anyone talk about it online. I think I first found out about it because one person mentioned it on YouTube, and I don't even remember who that was. But this series is the Finishing School series by Gail Carriger. So we have Etiquette and Espionage, Curtsies and Conspiracies, Waistcoats and Weaponry, and Manners and Mutiny. So this is for a teenage audience, about a girl called Sophronia, and it's set in Victorian times. Sophronia is sent to a finishing school so she can be taught manners and etiquette and the basic ways for women to behave in society in those times. But what her family don't realise is that this school also teaches espionage, like how to be spies and assassins, and it is really, really great fun. There's a steampunk fantasy. So they have like maids and butlers who are steam-powered, of course, because it's Victorian times. Also, it's paranormal because there are werewolves and vampires that are like normal in society. Like, people aren't surprised to see werewolves and vampires. They're not hidden, but they have like their own political standing. So werewolves, I think werewolves were like the lower class and vampires were the higher class. And so people are very judgy on which side you support. But it's a great series for teenagers or even young adults. I only read it a few years ago. And honestly, it's great fun. It's full of adventure. It's really light-hearted. So basically you're watching Sophronia go through, so 4 years, there's 4 books, there's 4 years of school. It's a boarding school as well, which, oh, by the way, It's set on a floating dirigible. So basically a big ship in the sky with hot air balloons holding it up. It is mad. Like, honestly, mad. They didn't put a map of it in until the last book. I'm so, like, ugh. So if you can see there, it's like a big ship which has a school inside it. And so you follow Sophronia as she goes through the school, learning, like, how to kill people, how to spy on people, whilst also, like, maintaining her ladylike image in society, like, being completely, like, following all the societal values that women are supposed to follow in that time period, whilst also, like, you know, murdering people. It's, like, it's so mad, it's so much fun. There's a lot of violence in this, but, like, it's not graphic violence, it's quite tame, and it's so good. She is such a wild character, and there's so many different characters and people you meet in the series, and it is so much fun. I then wanted to talk about another series, which is Orphan Monster Spy by Matt Killeen. The second book in this series, Devil Darling Spy, came out recently, and I'm currently in the middle of reading that book. This is another book set during World War II. It's about a Jewish girl called Sarah. She's like blonde hair, blue-eyed, like, she looks like a proper Aryan child, but she is Jewish. Her mum's Jewish. I think her dad was like an officer, or like, you know, proper like Nazi type, which is why she looks like the typical Nazi. So at the beginning of this book, Liesl loses her mother, and she basically joins up with a spy to infiltrate Nazis. So this book doesn't really focus on like the war and fighting aspect of World War II. She joins up with a British spy, and they need her to infiltrate a girls' boarding school. So Sarah goes to this boarding school and has to pretend like she's trying to become the perfect Nazi lady, and she needs to get to know a specific girl so that they can, like, infiltrate her dad, who's a scientist for the Nazis. I found it's a really fun story to read. Like, I enjoy boarding school settings, which is always good. And I also quite enjoy books set during World War II. Like, I find them really intriguing, because it's like, it's so recent, but like, it is such a bad thing to happen that it seems like it should be in the far distant past, whereas it's only like 80 years ago. Like, my grandparents lived through that. So yeah, World War II has always really intrigued me, like in history classes and things. I loved learning about it. It was such a, like, yeah, it seems mad that something like that would happen. So I really like reading fiction about it, especially like if it's set in Germany, which gives me a completely different perspective of it compared to the sort of thing that I was taught in school. So like I said, I'm currently in the middle of reading the sequel, Devil Darling Spy, which I was kind of sad to find that it wasn't set in the boarding school. So the second book is following a plague which is sort of ravaging Africa. Like, it was a parasite that was sent in Nazi bombs. So they purposefully sent this plague to this area of Africa. And because they're travelling to Africa, there's a big talk about sort of race, and they also do women's rights a lot as well, which I find a bit strange because it's written by a white man, which I don't know how other people might feel about that. So there's a character in the second book called Clementine, who is a black servant girl, and Claudine is taken along on their travels to Africa, and she's like a fierce, like, teenage girl. She doesn't want to take any nonsense from that white girl, so she's really commenting on the differences between like how black people are treated and like how white people behave. So it's quite interesting, but I'd like to hear a perspective, like an own voice's perspective on this sort of thing, because personally I don't really know like how people of colour would feel about a white man writing the sort of race argument. But I really enjoyed the first book. I'm still not sure about the second book. Like, I'm in the middle of it. I haven't got a rating yet. But I think if you enjoy reading books set in boarding schools or books set during World War II, then you'll really enjoy this book. The second book's good as well, but I think the first book could work as a standalone if you didn't want to read the second one. Then the final book on my list is one that I've only read fairly recently, and that is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I loved this book. Like, I put off reading this book for years. Like, I heard about it at university 5 years ago or something, and I didn't really know much about it, but this book is so much fun. If you like magic, if you like, say, like a circus setting, it's not really circusy. It's not really much of a circus. Like, they're just going around sort of a carnival and there's different acts and things. That's the only way it's sort of like a circus. It's a fantasy novel about two young people who are pitted against each other in a competition, and neither of them can really do a lot of magic when they start, but then they're trained up in magic over the years. This is a non-linear novel, so the timeline jumps around a lot, and you watch these two people over different years learning different things and getting to know each other. There's all this different magic, and you can see like different acts in the circus. They're like real magic right next to the ones that aren't quite so real. And this circus, like, it basically becomes infamous in the story. So it appears only at night time. So it appears in random towns at random times, and it's only open during the hours of darkness. So all these patrons come along to see the circus, and then it will just randomly vanish after a little while with no warning or anything. So there's a lot of mystery behind the circus itself, and there's a lot of different characters involved in this story. I found it so much fun. Like, I think it was the best book I've read so far this year. It was honestly so good. The characters are so different, and there's so many different like things happening in this story. It was great fun. So that was my list of some of my favourite books that I have read over the past few years. I have my Instagram and GoodReads linked down below, so feel free to check those out if you want to see what I'm reading at the moment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!